Today's episode is about making your animations look and feel good. After Effects gives us a lot of tools to achieve this, so I'm going to go through the basics one by one. First up, easing in the graph editor. By default, keyframes in After Effects are linear. I'll show you what that means. If I create a rectangle and keyframe its position at the 1000 pixel mark, move forward 10 frames and move it to the 2000 pixel mark, we can move along the timeline and see exactly what After Effects is doing. Each frame goes up by 100 across all 10 frames. After Effects is just dividing the change in value by the number of frames, and it fills in the in-between frames with a progression of the result. Now if I duplicate it and add an easy ease, you'll see it looks a little different. Instead of going up by 100, the first frame only goes up by 28, then 76, 112, 136, and 148. Finally brings us back in line with where the linear version is. It started off slower, but then goes faster in order to catch up. After this, it reverses to end at the exact same time as the linear version. Here's where you can visually fine-tune the animation. Play around with these handles and preview what happens when you make changes. You'll get a feel for what kind of motion feels right for what you are doing. There isn't a one-size-fits-all answer for easing. Next up, bezier curves. The next way to get smooth motion is with paths. Keyframes are mostly for establishing a start and end point. You shouldn't be dropping a ton of keyframes and manually creating a curved motion. Once you've got your start and end points keyframed, select them and right-click and go to Keyframe Interpolation. Under Spatial Interpolation, select Bezier. This will give your motion path handles that can be adjusted to fine-tune the object's path. If you add new position keyframes, After Effects will do its best to guess the path that it should take, but it doesn't always get it right. You'll probably have to make some adjustments as you go. You can combine this with the easing to get some interesting outcomes. Number 3, looping animations. Loops are created with a short script. By holding Alt or Option and clicking on the stopwatch next to any layer property, you'll open a small text editor. Here you can write scripts that enable more complex functionality than a standard keyframe. The scripts are essentially just JavaScript, but if you don't know JavaScript, don't let that scare you. You don't need to learn a whole programming language to do basic stuff like loops in After Effects, and After Effects will help you out. I'll drop this card in here, and I want it to shift on its y-axis back and forth. I'll give it a start and end keyframe. Now I'll bring up the text editor and start typing loop. Here you'll see that After Effects gives us some options. Today I'm just going to show you loop out, because I find myself using that one the most frequently. Loop out just means that the loop will begin after the final keyframe and continue forever unless something tells it not to. After selecting that option, we have to tell it what type of looping effect we want. To see our options, type a quotation mark. You should see 4 options: continue, cycle, offset, and ping pong. Continue just continues what you're doing. If you're rotating a card, it'll continue rotating at the same pace and direction as your keyframes were. Or if you were moving a card from left to right, it'll continue moving the same speed and direction from there on. Cycle is the looping you're probably most familiar with. It works just like a GIF. It plays through the keyframes and then repeats from the beginning again. Offset is used less frequently, but it can create some neat effects. Ping pong, just like it sounds, moves forward through keyframes and then backwards over and over. Right now, we're going to use ping pong. Use your arrow keys to move to ping pong and press enter. Now click away from the text editor and preview the animation. There it is. This kind of animation looks best as slow, subtle movements, so adjust it until it looks good. To make it even smoother, you can add an easy ease to the keyframes. Ping pong is fantastic for idle animations, making a card hover or the background element slowly moving. Idle animations are most useful when you have a long section without people on screen. They engage the viewer visually during a period where your video doesn't naturally have any visual engagement. For more information on loops with visual examples, I've linked a fantastic resource provided by School of Motion in the description below. I highly encourage you to give it a read. it's well worth your time. Up next, anticipation. Anticipation is an old school animation principle that still rings true today. Cartoons like Bugs Bunny, Wile E. Coyote, Mickey Mouse all utilized it, and you'll see it in Pixar films and anime as well. The way an object moves subconsciously conveys information to the viewer about that object. I'll give you an example. Here we have two identical situations, but one uses anticipation and the other does not. The example on the left looks mechanical almost. The two objects looks like they're being moved by an outside force, and we have no real concept of whether these things have any mass. The example on the right, despite it being nothing more than a rectangle, looks like it's intentionally jumping over the other rectangle. It also is giving the impression that it has weight and is being affected by gravity and its collision with the invisible surface when it lands. A simple way to use this with card graphics is to have the card pull back just before moving. Just remember, the longer the pullback is, the shorter the main movement should be, and vice versa. To make it look like it's hitting another object, you can add a little rotation the same way. Wiggles are another expression-based tool. They can be applied to pretty much any property, but for this, I'll use the position and rotation properties. Wiggles modify a value by adding or subtracting from a set value by a random amount within a given range. It continues to change the value repeatedly at a frequency of your choosing. It'll make sense when you see it in action, so let's drop a card onto the composition and add a wiggle effect. To do that, we'll press P to bring up the position properties, and then hold Option and click on the stopwatch to open the expression panel. Here we'll type wiggle, and press Enter when it autocompletes. Inside these parentheses, we'll add our amplitude and our frequency, separated by a comma. Amplitude being the maximum range from the norm that we want, and frequency being how many times per second we want the values to change. Unless you define otherwise, wiggle effects will be continuous. If you want it to start and stop at specific times, or to ramp up and back down, I've found that slider controls can be really handy. To make a controller, go to Layer, New, Null Object. This essentially creates a blank layer that you can apply various effects or connect other objects to. Search the Effects and Presets panel for Slider Control and double-click on it to apply it to the null layer. You'll see it pop up in the Layer Effects panel. Double-click on it again to add a second layer. Name the first slider Frequency and the second one Amplitude. After that, open up the card's position value by selecting it and hitting the P key, and hold Option and click on that stopwatch. In this expression panel, we just start typing wiggle, and you can hit Enter once autocomplete selects the right one. Open up the effects properties in the layer panel to show both frequency and amplitude. Then click back into your parentheses, and click and drag this pick whip over to the frequency property and let go. You'll see it automatically put in the code referencing this property. Now do the same for amplitude. Now that those are in there, you can adjust these sliders to get the speed and motion you'd like. If you want the motion to start at a certain time, you can just keyframe both at 0 just before that time, and then set the frequency and amplitude afterwards. Leaving some keyframes in between results in a motion ramping up over that time frame. While putting keyframes right next to each other results in it suddenly engaging fully. Motion blur can help animation feel smoother and more realistic, and luckily, it's really easy to apply. Just select your moving object and select this checkbox under the 3 circles. If you don't see the box, just change your menu mode down here. There are some more advanced blurring effects in the Effects and Presets panel, but most of the time the default motion blur will do the trick. If you're making a long video with a lot of effects, I recommend adding motion blur to the layer, but turning off motion blur to the entire composition until just before you render. Motion blur can be resource intensive, so leaving lots of them on during a long video can really slow down your preview playback. And that's it. By having these techniques in your animation toolbox, you'll be able to make your card animations even more impactful for your viewers. This video topic was actually suggested by a few viewers, so if there's anything you'd like to learn, leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes.